The cold bit deep into the bone, a constant companion in the stark, utilitarian confines of the Allied prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the Pacific. Here, amidst the barbed wire and watchtowers, a different kind of battle was being waged, not with bullets and bombs, but with an unyielding silence. Allied intelligence officers, hardened by years of brutal combat, found themselves confronting an enemy unlike any they had encountered on the battlefield. These were Japanese soldiers, captured and interned, yet their spirit remained a fortress. Standard interrogation techniques, honed over decades, yielded little. Threats were met with stoicism, promises with suspicion. The men seemed to possess an almost impenetrable psychological barrier, a collective will to resist any attempt at extracting information, or even engaging in basic human interaction. They were ghosts in their own bodies, their eyes reflecting a profound, almost terrifying emptiness. But what if this impenetrable wall wasn't defiance, but something far more fragile, a despair so deep it masqueraded as strength? And what if the very system designed to break them was about to offer an unexpected, almost absurd lifeline? The air in the interrogation tents often hung thick with the metallic tang of stale coffee and the unspoken frustration of the Allied officers. Day after day, the same blank stares, the same quiet refusal to engage. Intelligence reports stalled. Tactical insights remained elusive. It was a stalemate, a silent war of attrition that wore down the captors as much as the captured. The threat was subtle but pervasive, a complete intelligence blackout from a formidable enemy, leaving critical gaps in understanding their mindset and future movements. Yet amidst this grinding deadlock, an unconventional idea began to surface, born not of strategic brilliance, but of sheer desperation. What if the key to unlocking these silent men wasn't more pressure, but something entirely different? The question lingered, a quiet hum beneath the drone of camp life. Could a gesture of humanity, however small, truly pierce such an absolute resolve, or would it simply be perceived as another more insidious trick? Over time, the relentless focus on conventional intelligence gathering began to shift. The sheer scale of the psychological resistance was unprecedented. These prisoners, seemingly devoid of hope, had become a puzzle, their collective despair a barrier more formidable than any physical defense. The camp commanders grappled with the implications. Managing men so utterly disconnected was not merely a challenge to intelligence, but a profound drain on resources, a constant, low-level tension that permeated every aspect of camp operations. What exactly was driving this profound, almost suicidal detachment? The officers, poring over sparse psychological profiles, noted a recurring theme: the deeply ingrained cultural imperative of honor, shame, and the perception of capture as a fate worse than death. It wasn't merely a tactic, it was an existential state. But still the question persisted. Even within such rigid frameworks, wasn't there some flicker of ordinary human need? Guarda este detalle. The very notion of hopelessness was about to be challenged by something utterly mundane, something that arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paper. The tactical stakes escalated. As the POWs slowly re-engaged with the world, their psychological barriers, once impenetrable, showed tiny fissures. They still offered little direct intelligence, but their general demeanor changed. A flicker of hope, however faint, made them more receptive to basic camp routines, less prone to the deep, silent despair that had made them almost unmanageable. The Allied command realized they weren't just managing prisoners. They were, inadvertently, conducting an unprecedented experiment in psychological warfare, using empathy as an unexpected weapon. The threat, however, remained. Could this fragile connection be weaponized against them, or would it lead to deeper resentment if mismanaged? The first signs of this shift were almost imperceptible. A new directive arrived, a stack of sealed crates, their contents unusual for a war zone. The smell of wood and dust filled the air as they were unloaded, a stark contrast to the usual scent of canvas, sweat, and rationed food. Inside these unassuming containers lay not weapons or medical supplies, but something far more potent, something that would cut through the deep silence of the camps. But why would the Allied forces invest in such an unconventional, almost sentimental endeavor when the war still raged? Was this an act of genuine compassion? Or a calculated, elaborate psychological trap? What was the true motive behind this unprecedented move? The answer arrived not with a declaration, but with the quiet scrape of crate lids being pried open. Inside, meticulously sorted and bundled, lay thousands of letters, postcards, and small, flat packages. The air in the storage tent, usually heavy with the scent of canvas and disinfectant, now carried faint traces of dried ink and aged paper, a ghostly echo of distant homes. These were not intelligence documents or propaganda leaflets. They were personal communications collected from neutral countries, intercepted mail routes, and even directly from Japan, all addressed to the very men deemed hopelessly lost. The initial reaction from the Japanese prisoners was a deepening of their already profound silence. Suspicion hung in the air, a palpable chill that cut through the tropical humidity. Was this a new form of torture? A cruel trick designed to offer a glimmer of solace, only to snatch it away? The guards, usually impassive, moved with an almost awkward reverence, their hands carefully handling the brittle envelopes. What unseen mechanism compelled the Allied command to expend such resources on the personal mail of their enemies? With the passing weeks, a strange ritual began to unfold. Each morning, a small detail of Allied personnel, sometimes accompanied by a Japanese-speaking interpreter, would arrive at the barracks. They carried not rifles, but bundles of letters. The sunlight, usually harsh and unforgiving, seemed to soften as it filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating the delicate act of calling out names. The first few times, few men responded. Their faces remained impassive, their eyes fixed on some distant, invisible horizon. The letters, left on benches, often lay untouched for hours, sometimes even days, as if tainted. But then, a detail. One afternoon, a young private, a new arrival to the camp, mistakenly left a letter on the cot of a prisoner who had been known for his absolute, unyielding silence. The next morning, the letter was gone. No one saw it taken, no one heard a rustle. It simply vanished. This was the first tiny fissure in the psychological barrier, a crack barely visible to the naked eye. The Allied officers, accustomed to the rigid protocols of war, found themselves observing a new kind of engagement, one built on the fragile, almost absurd premise of trust. Yet, this was not a swift transformation. For days, the routine continued. More letters arrived, more names were called. The smell of ink and paper became a subtle, almost comforting presence in the otherwise sterile camp environment. Still, the overwhelming majority of prisoners maintained their stoic facade. The puzzle remained. How could such a seemingly innocuous gesture penetrate such an entrenched collective despair? What was the true intent behind this unprecedented act of wartime empathy? Soon, a faint murmur began to ripple through the barracks. A quiet whisper, a barely audible sigh. An old sergeant, his face etched with the weariness of 1,000 battles, was seen holding a faded photograph. His thumb tracing the outline of a smiling face. The texture of the paper, worn thin with handling, was a stark contrast to the rough fabric of his uniform. It was a fleeting moment, gone before most could register it, yet it spoke volumes. The reward was not information, but a flicker of something far more profound. Enemies on the battlefield. The Allied captors were now in a strange twist of fate, delivering whispers from home. The meticulous process of sorting, translating, and delivering these letters was an administrative burden, a logistical nightmare, in a war where every resource was precious. But the command continued, driven by the faint hope that this unconventional approach might yield something that threats and deprivations never could. The question persisted. Was this truly a path to salvation for these lost men, or a dangerously naive experiment that could backfire, cultivating a deeper, more personal resentment if their hopes were ultimately dashed? Pause for a moment. If stories that turn your expectations upside down intrigue you, subscribe to WW2 Beyond Battles to catch the next unexpected turns. The camp routine, once a monotonous rhythm of despair, began to subtly shift. The morning calls for mail, initially met with a wall of indifference, started to draw a few more eyes, a slight tilt of a head. The guards, who had anticipated resistance, now observed a different kind of tension, a quiet apprehension. The air, typically thick with the smell of stale rations and damp earth, occasionally carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of distant homes, clinging to the paper. It was a new, unsettling normalcy, built on the fragile hope of a connection that should, by all wartime logic, be impossible. Soon another crumb of strangeness emerged. A small, designated area in one of the barracks, previously ignored, became a silent reading room. No furniture, just the bare floor. Yet here a handful of prisoners would sit, hunched over their letters, their faces illuminated by the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The rustle of paper was the only sound, a stark contrast to the clatter of mess halls or the distant hum of camp generators. What was it about these thin sheets of paper that could carve out such a sanctuary in the heart of a prison camp? The officers, watching from a distance, noted the subtle changes. A prisoner, who had refused food for days, was seen carefully folding a letter into the breast pocket of his tattered uniform. Another, whose gaze had been perpetually fixed on the ground, now held a small, crudely drawn picture, a faint smile playing on his lips. These were not acts of defiance, nor were they signs of immediate cooperation. They were glimpses of something deeper, a reawakening of individual humanity beneath the rigid veneer of military stoicism. The threat of a collective psychological breakdown was receding, replaced by the enigma of individual re-engagement. Yet this fragile shift came with its own set of anxieties. Some letters contained news of loss, of homes destroyed, of loved ones gone. These moments were often followed by a renewed retreat into silence, sometimes even a quiet, almost imperceptible shudder. The Allied command, in their unprecedented experiment, found themselves confronting the double-edged sword of empathy. They were offering solace, but also potentially delivering grief. Was this calculated risk truly worth the uncertain reward? Or would the pain of distant news ultimately break these men more completely than any interrogation ever could? Ensign Miller, a young intelligence officer tasked with overseeing the mail distribution, often found himself observing the scene with a mix of fascination and unease. He recalled one afternoon, a particularly hot and humid day, when a prisoner received a letter from his wife. The man, renowned for his unyielding silence, held the envelope for a long moment, his fingers tracing the calligraphy. Then, he slowly opened it, and as he read, a single tear tracked a path through the dust on his cheek. It was a private moment, observed only by Miller and the impassive guard, but it revealed a depth of emotion that had been deemed impossible. What no one expected was the almost ritualistic care with which these letters were handled. They weren't just read, they were cherished. Some prisoners would spend hours running their fingers over the characters, as if trying to extract the very essence of home from the paper. The texture of the thin rice paper, the faint scent of charcoal ink, became anchors to a world they had believed lost forever. This was not intelligence. It was an intimate act of remembrance, a silent defiance of the brutal present. But the question remained, why was such an effort being made? The logistical challenges were immense. The resources significant. Was this truly an act of strategic compassion, or a more sophisticated form of psychological warfare, designed to subtly undermine the enemy's resolve by re-establishing their personal connections? The officers debated, their voices low, the humid air heavy with their uncertainty. The answers were still elusive, hidden behind the quiet rustle of paper and the inscrutable faces of the prisoners. Over time, small, almost absurd normalities began to permeate the camp. Prisoners would occasionally exchange portions of their meager rations for a chance to sit closer to the light when reading their letters. Some would even attempt crude drawings or carvings, inspired by the images or descriptions from home, using scavenged bits of wood or stone. These were not the actions of broken men, but of individuals slowly, painstakingly rebuilding small pieces of their shattered lives. The promise of information remained largely unfulfilled, but something far more profound was taking root. The threat of their collective despair had lessened, but the enigma of their motivation deepened. What exactly was the Allied command hoping to achieve with this unprecedented, almost paternal gesture? And what would happen if or when the flow of these precious whispers from home inevitably ceased? The camp, once a crucible of stark brutality, had become an unlikely stage for a quiet, human drama, its outcome uncertain, its implications far-reaching. Como pasar das semanas, the quiet human drama within the camps deepened. The initial, solitary act of reading letters gradually evolved. Prisoners, once isolated in their despair, began to share. A man might read a passage aloud to a trusted comrade, his voice a low murmur describing a familiar landscape or a child's drawing. The rustle of paper was now accompanied by the soft intake of breath, a shared, silent recognition of a world outside the wire. This wasn't overt communication with their captors, but a re-establishment of internal bonds, a subtle shift from individual suffering to communal recollection. Yet this fragile resurgence of connection raised new questions for the Allied observers. Was this a sign of resilience, or a dangerous vulnerability that could be exploited? The threat of their collective silence had transformed into the enigma of their quiet rekindling. What did this mean for the enemy mindset? The officers, though still wary, noted a slight easing in the pervasive tension, a faint echo of normalcy in the most abnormal of settings. Soon, the guards themselves found their perspectives subtly altered. They were no longer just overseeing a mass of unyielding prisoners, but individuals with names, with families, with stories contained in fragile envelopes. Private Jenkins, on patrol, once saw a prisoner openly weeping while clutching a letter. Instead of the usual stern command, he merely looked away, pretending not to notice. The metallic scent of the guard tower's steel, usually a symbol of absolute authority, now seemed to mingle with a faint, almost imagined, scent of distant cherry blossoms, carried on the paper. Still, the underlying question persisted. Was this easing of tension a genuine breakthrough, or a dangerous illusion? The Allied command wrestled with the ethical implications of their experiment. They were providing comfort, yes, but also potentially stirring emotions that could lead to deeper pain if the connection was severed. The why loop remained wide open, its motivations still ambiguous. In contrast to the rigid military structure, small acts of personal expression began to emerge. Some prisoners, inspired by descriptions in their letters, would meticulously sketch familiar scenes on scraps of paper or carve tiny figurines from scavenged wood, their fingers calloused but surprisingly delicate. The scratch of a makeshift tool against wood, the focused gaze under the dim barrack light, spoke of a profound need to recreate, however faintly, the beauty of a lost world. The rough texture of the wood, worked smooth by careful hands, became a tactile link to a life beyond the barbed wire. This was not intelligence, nor was it defiance. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a quiet act of mental survival. But what did these personal rituals signify for the larger war effort? Did they offer a path to understanding, or merely a distraction from the brutal realities of their captivity? The next shock would come not from a grand strategy, but from the most basic human need, communication. While these subtle shifts took root, a new layer of absurd normalcy began to manifest around the letters themselves. Some prisoners, encountering unfamiliar characters or regional dialects in their mail, would hesitantly approach the Japanese-speaking Allied interpreters. The quiet murmur of questions, the rustle of a letter being unfolded, broke the long-standing wall of silence. They were not asking for strategic information, but for help understanding a message from home. The sound of their own language, spoken by an enemy, was a jarring contrast to the constant drone of English commands. Ensign Miller, observing these interactions, noted the tentative nature of these requests. The prisoner's eyes, once vacant, now held a flicker of something akin to desperate hope. The very act of asking for help, of admitting a need, was a monumental step, a crack in the collective facade. But was this tentative bridge building a path to cooperation, or merely a more nuanced form of psychological resistance, a way to gain access to their precious lifeline? The logistical burden on the Allied side grew. Interpreters were now not only translating official documents, but also deciphering family gossip, local news, and expressions of love and longing. The smell of ink and paper in the translation office became a constant, almost domestic presence. This was far beyond conventional prisoner management, venturing into an unforeseen realm where the personal became intertwined with the strategic. The why of this extraordinary effort continued to be debated in hushed tones among the command staff. What no one had fully anticipated was the way these letters began to reshape the social fabric within the camp itself. Prisoners started to form small, informal groups, sharing news from their respective prefectures, comparing the handwriting of their wives, or discussing the implications of a particular turn of phrase. The sound of quiet conversations, once almost unheard, became a low thrum in the barracks. A stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had defined their early captivity. The faint light of dawn, filtering through the windows, now illuminated not just rows of silent men, but small circles of individuals poring over their shared connection to the outside world. The shared experience of receiving mail, once a source of individual anguish, was slowly transforming into a catalyst for community. Yet the true purpose behind the Allies' continued commitment to this program remained a profound enigma. Was it a calculated ploy or a genuine, if desperate, attempt at human connection in the crucible of war? The shared experience of receiving mail, once a source of individual anguish, was slowly transforming into a catalyst for community. Yet the true purpose behind the Allies' continued commitment to this program remained a profound enigma. Was it a calculated ploy or a genuine, if desperate, attempt at human connection in the crucible of war? With the passing weeks, a new, almost sacred ritual took root. The letters, once objects of suspicion, became revered. Prisoners would store them carefully, often wrapped in scraps of cloth, tucked into the deepest pockets of their uniforms, or hidden beneath their sleeping mats. The faint rustle of paper, A sound once alien to the barracks now signified a moment of private communion. The worn edges, the faded ink, the delicate creases. Each detail was a tangible link to a world they had been taught to forget. But this reverence also brought a new vulnerability. What if these precious objects were lost, or worse, confiscated? The threat of such a loss hung unspoken, a shadow beneath the fragile light of rekindled hope. The Allied officers observed this burgeoning attachment with a mix of satisfaction and concern. They had provided a lifeline, but also a new point of leverage, or perhaps a new source of potential devastation. Why were they continuing to foster such a delicate dependence? Soon, the act of writing, even without the guarantee of sending, became another absurd normality. Using scavenged pencils and any available scrap of paper, brown wrapping from rations, flattened cigarette cartons, prisoners began to compose their own letters. Their fingers, accustomed to the rough grip of tools or weapons, now moved with a halting delicacy, forming kanji characters that spoke of longing, of memory, of a desperate hope for reunion. The faint scratch of lead on paper, often late into the night, was a quiet symphony of resilience. These weren't official communications. They were deeply personal missives, often addressed to wives, children, or elderly parents, detailing mundane camp life or recalling cherished moments from home. The texture of the rough paper, the smudged ink, bore witness to the effort. This wasn't intelligence gathering. It was an exercise in preserving identity, a way to mentally bridge the vast, brutal chasm of their captivity. Ensign Miller, supervising the collection of these unsent letters, noted the meticulous care in their creation. He often wondered about the unspoken stories they held, the emotional weight of words that might never reach their intended recipients. The sheer volume of these homemade letters, growing steadily, spoke to a profound psychological shift. It was a silent testament to a yearning for connection that transcended the immediate realities of war. Yet, a new layer of the paradox emerged. While these letters brought solace, they also brought news of a changing world, often a world irrevocably altered by conflict. The emotional cost of such distant news was immense. A prisoner might receive a letter detailing a child's first steps, or a typhoon that ravaged his home village. The joy of connection could quickly turn to a quiet internal grief, a fresh wound to an already scarred spirit. The air in the barracks, once thick with an almost tangible despair, now carried a different emotional charge. Moments of quiet smiles mingled with sudden, profound silences. The guards, walking their patrols, could sometimes hear a low, choked sob from a dark corner, a sound rarely heard before the mail began to arrive. This was not the defiance of a hardened warrior, but the raw vulnerability of a man confronted with his humanity. What no one had fully anticipated was the subtle impact on the physical environment of the camp itself. The barracks, once rigidly uniform and devoid of personal touches, began to show faint signs of individual expression. A small, carefully pressed flower from a letter might be tucked into a crack in the wall. A crudely drawn family portrait, inspired by a photograph, could be found pinned above a sleeping mat. These were not acts of rebellion, but quiet assertions of self, tiny beacons of memory in a bleak landscape. The officers debated the implications of these changes. Was this a sign of softening, a prelude to greater cooperation, or was it merely a deeper entrenchment of their inner world, making them even more resistant to external influence? The why behind the Allied command's continued indulgence in this program remained a subject of intense, hushed discussion. The threat, once a collective psychological barrier, had transformed into the nuanced risk of emotional manipulation. Soon, the routine of mail delivery became the focal point of the week, a palpable shift in the camp's rhythm. The morning a new batch of letters was expected, a subtle tension would build. The usual clatter of mess halls seemed to quiet, replaced by an expectant hush. The prisoners, usually withdrawn, would gather near the designated distribution point, their eyes, once vacant, now betraying a flicker of anticipation. The smell of the humid air mixed with the faint, almost hopeful, scent of distant paper. This was not the calm of resignation, but the quiet hum of renewed hope. The guards, too, felt the shift. Their interactions with the prisoners, while still formal, now carried an undercurrent of something akin to shared understanding, a recognition of the universal human need for connection. The once impenetrable psychological wall was not shattered, but rather, slowly, painstakingly, being chipped away, piece by piece, by the most unexpected of tools. The chipping away was slow, almost imperceptible in its daily increments, yet undeniable over weeks. The mail call, once a formal, almost hostile announcement, transformed into a peculiar daily anticipation. The sound of the interpreter's voice, calling out names, no longer met with a wall of absolute silence, but with a subtle tension, a collective breath held. The early morning light, filtering through the humid air of the barrack windows, would catch motes of dust dancing above the heads of men whose gazes, once fixed on the floor, now flickered towards the bundles of paper. This shift wasn't a sudden surrender, but a gradual re-engagement born from the simple, undeniable human need for connection. The scent of stale sweat and damp earth, usually pervasive, was now occasionally punctuated by the fainter, more delicate aroma of dried ink and aged paper, a phantom whisper of distant homes. But was this fragile bridge of communication truly a path to understanding, or merely a new, more subtle battlefield for the hearts and minds of the prisoners? The Allied command remained wary, their strategic curiosity battling with ethical concerns. Soon, the act of receiving a letter transcended personal solace and began to foster a nascent form of communal healing. A prisoner might, after days of private contemplation, share a detail from his letter with a trusted compatriot, a memory of a village festival, a description of a mountain path. The quiet murmur of Japanese voices, once absent, now formed a low, comforting hum in the barracks, a stark contrast to the earlier oppressive silence. The rough texture of a shared photograph, passed from hand to hand, became a tangible link to a collective past. What no one anticipated was how these shared moments would subtly alter the dynamics between the prisoners themselves. Old rivalries, born of military hierarchy and wartime stress, began to soften. A shared laugh over a child's clumsy drawing, or a quiet nod of understanding at news of a distant typhoon, forged new, unexpected bonds. The threat of internal fragmentation, a constant concern in any POW camp, began to recede, replaced by a quiet, collective resilience. Ensign Miller, observing these interactions, noted the nuanced shift. He saw men who had been utterly withdrawn now engaging in hushed conversations, their eyes alight with shared memories. The sound of their language, once a symbol of their impenetrable otherness, now carried the universal tones of human connection. Yet the strategic implications remained ambiguous. Was this renewed sense of community a step towards cooperation, or simply a strengthening of their collective resolve against their captors? The why behind the Allies' continued commitment to this program remained an open question, debated in the hushed confines of intelligence briefings. The prisoners, in turn, began to develop intricate, unspoken rituals around their mail. Letters were not merely read and discarded. They were meticulously folded, often wrapped in scavenged cloth, and hidden in personal recesses, a hollowed-out piece of wood, a seam in a sleeping mat. The faint rustle of paper, a sound once associated with official documents, now signified a private almost sacred act of remembrance. The delicate creases on a letter, the worn edges from repeated handling, were maps of their internal worlds. This careful preservation was a silent defiance against the harsh realities of their captivity, a refusal to let their past be erased. The temperature inside the barracks, often stifling, seemed to hold a strange warmth when these personal treasures were brought out. But this growing attachment also created a new vulnerability. The threat of these cherished objects being lost or confiscated loomed large, an unspoken fear that could easily shatter the fragile peace. Soon, the desire to respond became an overwhelming impulse, even without a clear means of delivery. Using bits of charcoal, scavenged pencils, and any scrap of paper, the brown wrapping from a ration box, a flattened cigarette carton, prisoners began to write. Their fingers, once trained for weapons, moved with painstaking care, forming the intricate strokes of kanji. The faint scratch of charcoal on rough paper, often late into the night, was a testament to an unyielding spirit. These letters, filled with mundane details of camp life, fervent hopes for reunion, or simple expressions of love, were rarely sent. They were, instead, a form of psychological self-preservation, a way to maintain a connection to a world that seemed to be slipping away. The texture of the coarse paper, bearing the smudged imprints of their thoughts, became a physical manifestation of their longing. The Allied officers, collecting these unsent missives, found themselves holding not just words, but fragments of souls. What nobody expected was the almost tangible shift in the camp's overall atmosphere. The oppressive silence, once a heavy blanket of despair, began to lift. The guards reported fewer incidents of self-harm, less overt defiance, and a subtle, almost imperceptible softening in the prisoners' eyes. The air, while still carrying the stark sense of a military camp, now had moments where the faint, almost imagined, perfume of distant cherry blossoms seemed to linger, a ghost of home carried on the paper. The threat of an unmanageable, psychologically impenetrable enemy was slowly giving way to the enigma of a re-engaged, albeit still guarded, human collective. The why behind this unprecedented experiment, however, remained profoundly elusive. Was this a calculated psychological maneuver, or had genuine, if accidental, empathy truly broken through the brutal logic of war? The next step in this strange evolution would reveal a deeper, more profound truth. The gradual re-engagement extended even to the most basic aspects of daily life. Meals, once consumed in a heavy, silent ritual of sustenance, now occasionally saw hushed exchanges between prisoners about news from their respective regions, or the mention of a particular dish from home. The metallic clang of mess kits, a sound of monotonous routine, was subtly altered by the quiet murmurs, a faint echo of domesticity. This was not yet a full return to normalcy, but a significant departure from the profound isolation that had defined their initial captivity. The Allied command, while noting these positive changes, continued to weigh the risks. What if this fragile connection, built on personal letters, was suddenly severed? Could the resulting despair be even more catastrophic than their initial state of hopelessness? The ethical tightrope they walked was thin, stretched taut across the chasm of wartime necessity. The why of their commitment remained central to their internal debates, a complex interplay of intelligence gathering, resource management, and an unforeseen human experiment. Soon, a new, unexpected layer of interaction emerged. Some prisoners, with the help of the interpreters, began to draw simple pictures for their families, using the same scavenged materials they used for writing. These were not elaborate artworks, but heartfelt sketches of camp life, or attempts to depict their current surroundings, a visual bridge to their loved ones. The scratch of pencil on rough paper, the focused intensity in their eyes, spoke of a desperate need to communicate beyond words. The texture of these crude drawings, passed to the Allied officers for potential forwarding, was a raw, tactile representation of hope. This was a profound step. It signified a willingness to actively engage, however minimally, with their captors for the sake of their families. It was not a request for intelligence, but a plea for connection, a quiet assertion of their enduring humanity. The cold, sterile air of the intelligence office now occasionally carried the faint, sweet scent of newly worked charcoal, a strange juxtaposition. The threat of an utterly uncommunicative enemy was largely gone, replaced by the far more complex challenge of managing deeply re-engaged, emotionally vulnerable individuals. The threat of an utterly uncommunicative enemy was largely gone, replaced by the far more complex challenge of managing deeply re-engaged, emotionally vulnerable individuals. The Allied command found themselves at a precipice, staring not at an impenetrable wall, but at a delicate, intricate web of human emotion. They had provided a conduit for connection, but now faced the monumental decision of whether to truly bridge the chasm. The why of their continued commitment to this unprecedented experiment remained, a silent question hanging in the humid air of the Pacific camps. What no one, not even the most seasoned intelligence officer, had truly foreseen was the next profound turning point. It arrived not with the roar of planes or the clang of steel, but with the quiet rustle of paper. After weeks of collecting unsent letters and simple drawings, a decision was made. A calculated risk, perhaps, but one born from observing the profound human need that had emerged. One morning, the routine mail call was different. Instead of the usual bundles of incoming mail from Japan, which themselves had become a lifeline, a new, distinct collection was presented. It was a smaller pile, but its significance was immense. Each envelope was thick, bearing the official postmark of an Allied postal service, and crucially, the crisp, unmistakable scent of return mail. These were not fresh letters from home. These were replies to the letters the prisoners had written, the very letters they had believed would never leave the camp. The silence that fell over the barracks was absolute, a stark contrast to the low hum of anticipation that usually preceded mail call. The light filtering through the high windows seemed to freeze the dust motes in the air. Men stared, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a fragile, desperate hope. The texture of these envelopes felt different in their hands, heavier, more real, almost sacred. This was not just paper. It was a tangible, undeniable link, a whisper across oceans that had been answered. The effect was instantaneous and profound. A prisoner, clutching an envelope with a familiar family crest, might tremble, his fingers fumbling with the seal. The soft tear of paper, as a letter was opened, became the loudest sound in the room. Then a choked sob or a sudden profound gasp. These were not the stoic, unyielding warriors the Allies had captured. These were fathers, sons, husbands, confronted with the living proof that they were not forgotten, that their own words had reached home. This was the true turning point. The paradox that had defined their captivity, the cruelty of war juxtaposed with the sudden, unexpected kindness of delivering mail, was now reframed. It wasn't about breaking their will or extracting intelligence through manipulation. This quiet, almost miraculous act of facilitating two-way communication revealed a deeper mechanism, the acknowledgement of their enduring humanity, even in the heart of conflict. The threat of an impenetrable, uncommunicative enemy had dissolved, replaced by the shared vulnerability of human connection itself. What this unprecedented act would mean for the future, for the very legacy of how prisoners of war were treated, was a question that would echo far beyond the war. If stories of unexpected human connection in the crucible of war intrigue you, remember there are countless other narratives waiting. You can find complimentary episodes with behind-the-scenes insights, photos, and personal accounts that amplify these turning points in the special series on WW2 Beyond Battles. The barracks, once a tomb of silence, now held a new symphony of emotion. A man might read a phrase aloud, his voice cracking, sharing news of a child's progress or a wife's steadfast love. The rough, calloused hands that had clutched rifles now gently smoothed out creased paper, tracing familiar handwriting. The smell of stale camp rations was momentarily overwhelmed by the faint, almost imagined, perfume of distant gardens carried on the pages. This was not just a delivery. It was a revival, a quiet resurrection of spirit. The Allied officers, observing from a distance, felt the weight of the moment. Ensign Miller, watching a grizzled veteran openly weep while clutching a child's drawing, understood. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a strategy. This was the raw, undeniable power of human connection, breaking through every barrier of language, culture, and war. The why behind the Allies' decision to take this monumental step to facilitate genuine two-way mail suddenly seemed less about strategic gain and more about a profound, if accidental, recognition of shared humanity. The profound shift rippled through the camp not as a sudden tsunami, but as a slow, inexorable tide. The silence that had once been a hallmark of their despair was now punctuated by a new kind of sound, the murmur of men reading excerpts from their letters aloud, sharing a snippet of home with a trusted friend. The rough texture of the barrack walls, once a cold boundary, now often bore the faint marks of fingers tracing words in the dim light. A silent rereading of precious messages. The air, still damp and heavy, began to hold the subtle warmth of shared human presence, a stark contrast to the earlier chill of isolation. This wasn't merely a moment of relief, it was a profound shift in the very fabric of their existence. The ability to send letters and, miraculously, receive replies transformed the prisoners' self-perception. They were no longer simply nameless combatants stripped of identity. They were individuals, connected to families, to a world that acknowledged their continued existence. The metallic clang of mess kits at mealtime, previously a harsh reminder of their captivity, sometimes coincided with a quiet smile, a man recalling a shared meal from a letter. Yet, the question lingered. What did this unprecedented act truly signify for the Allied command? Was it a calculated gamble, a subtle form of psychological warfare designed to foster compliance? Or had the sheer weight of human empathy genuinely altered their strategic calculus? The officers, though observing the positive changes, remained acutely aware of the delicate balance. They had inadvertently opened a door, but the path ahead was still fraught with unknowns. The faint scent of distant paper, once a novelty, now mingled with the ever-present smell of damp earth, grounding this extraordinary experiment in the harsh reality of war. With the capacity for two-way communication, the camp environment subtly transformed. The small, carefully hidden personal items, a pressed flower, a crude drawing, now carried an even deeper significance. They were no longer mere memories, but active participants in a living exchange. Prisoners began to meticulously organize their correspondence, creating small, improvised archives in hidden crevices of their bunks. The soft rustle of these cherished papers, a private symphony, replaced the earlier, brooding silence. This renewed connection, however, was a double-edged sword. While it brought immense solace, it also brought news of hardship, loss, or changes that sharpened the pangs of separation. A letter detailing a child's illness or the destruction of a beloved family home by bombing could plunge a man into a profound, personal grief. The guards, walking their patrols, sometimes heard not just quiet murmurs, but the raw, choked sounds of men grappling with distant sorrows, a new emotional landscape for them to navigate. The Allied officers, particularly those involved in intelligence, grappled with the implications. Ensign Miller, meticulously documenting these shifts, noted the paradox. The more humanized the prisoners became, the more complex their management. The once clear-cut lines of enemy and captive blurred with each shared laugh, each silent tear. The why behind their sustained commitment to this program became a topic of intense, sometimes uncomfortable, debate within their ranks. Was it a strategic advantage to have emotionally engaged rather than utterly despairing prisoners? Or was it simply the unforeseen consequence of a compassionate gesture? Soon, the act of writing letters evolved beyond simple communication. It became a ritual of hope. Prisoners would spend hours crafting their replies, choosing each word with care, sketching small, detailed illustrations of their daily life or memories of home. The scratch of pencil on paper, often under the flickering light of a single bulb, was no longer a desperate act of self-preservation, but a conscious effort to maintain a vibrant connection, to project a future. The texture of these carefully folded letters, passed to the Allied interpreters, carried the palpable weight of expectation. This sustained engagement led to unexpected collaborations. Some prisoners, having received news of specific family needs, began to use their limited access to camp resources, or even their own meager rations, to create small handcrafted items to send home. A carved wooden bird, a woven mat from scavenged fibers. These were not just gifts, but tangible proofs of their continued existence and love. The faint, earthy smell of freshly worked wood or fiber would occasionally drift through the barracks, a testament to this burgeoning, quiet industry of affection. What no one had fully anticipated was the subtle shift in the dynamic between the prisoners and their captors. While the power imbalance remained, the shared ritual of mail, though facilitating these precious connections, fostered a nascent, unspoken understanding. A guard might offer a small piece of twine for a prisoner to secure a letter, or an interpreter might spend extra time ensuring a message was perfectly conveyed. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant, were building fragile bridges of mutual respect across the chasm of war. Yet, the larger strategic implications of this human experiment remained a subject of intense scrutiny. The initial goal of extracting intelligence had been largely superseded by the unforeseen psychological impact. The prisoners, while more communicative, were not necessarily more compliant in matters of military intelligence. The why of the Allies' continued investment in this project, diverting resources, manpower, and risk, was still being written, a complex narrative of war and unexpected humanity. The next question was, how would this profound shift influence the very landscape of their future, both within and beyond the camp walls? The profound shift rippled through the camp, not as a sudden tsunami, but as a slow, inexorable tide. The silence that had once been a hallmark of their despair was now punctuated by a new kind of sound. The murmur of men reading excerpts from their letters aloud, sharing a snippet of home with a trusted friend. The rough texture of the barrack walls, once a cold boundary, now often bore the faint marks of fingers tracing words in the dim light, a silent rereading of precious messages. The air, still damp and heavy, began to hold the subtle warmth of shared human presence, a stark contrast to the earlier chill of isolation. This wasn't merely a moment of relief. It was a profound shift in the very fabric of their existence. The ability to send letters and miraculously receive replies transformed the prisoners' self-perception. They were no longer simply nameless combatants, stripped of identity. They were individuals, connected to families, to a world that acknowledged their continued existence. The metallic clang of mess kits at mealtime, previously a harsh reminder of their captivity, sometimes coincided with a quiet smile, a man recalling a shared meal from a letter. Yet the question lingered, what did this unprecedented act truly signify for the Allied command? Was it a calculated gamble? A subtle form of psychological warfare designed to foster compliance? Or had the sheer weight of human empathy genuinely altered their strategic calculus? The officers, though observing the positive changes, remained acutely aware of the delicate balance. They had inadvertently opened a door, but the path ahead was still fraught with unknowns. The faint scent of distant paper, once a novelty, now mingled with the ever-present smell of damp earth, grounding this extraordinary experiment in the harsh reality of war. With the capacity for two-way communication, the camp environment subtly transformed. The small, carefully hidden personal items, a pressed flower, a crude drawing, now carried an even deeper significance. They were no longer mere memories, but active participants in a living exchange. Prisoners began to meticulously organize their correspondence, creating small, improvised archives in hidden crevices of their bunks. The soft rustle of these cherished papers, a private symphony, replaced the earlier brooding silence. This renewed connection, however, was a double-edged sword. While it brought immense solace, it also brought news of hardship, loss, or changes that sharpened the pangs of separation. A letter detailing a child's illness or the destruction of a beloved family home by bombing could plunge a man into a profound personal grief. The guards, walking their patrols, sometimes heard not just quiet murmurs, but the raw, choked sounds of men grappling with distant sorrows. A new emotional landscape for them to navigate. The Allied officers, particularly those involved in intelligence, grappled with the implications. Ensign Miller, meticulously documenting these shifts, noted the paradox. The more humanized the prisoners became, the more complex their management. The once clear-cut lines of enemy and captive blurred with each shared laugh, each silent tear. The why behind their sustained commitment to this program became a topic of intense, sometimes uncomfortable debate within their ranks. Was it a strategic advantage to have emotionally engaged rather than utterly despairing prisoners? Or was it simply the unforeseen consequence of a compassionate gesture? Soon, the act of writing letters evolved beyond simple communication. It became a ritual of hope. Prisoners would spend hours crafting their replies, choosing each word with care, sketching small, detailed illustrations of their daily life or memories of home. The scratch of pencil on paper, often under the flickering light of a single bulb, was no longer a desperate act of self-preservation, but a conscious effort to maintain a vibrant connection, to project a future. The texture of these carefully folded letters, passed to the Allied interpreters, carried the palpable weight of expectation. This sustained engagement led to unexpected collaborations. Some prisoners, having received news of specific family needs, began to use their limited access to camp resources, or even their own meager rations, to create small, handcrafted items to send home. A carved wooden bird, a woven mat from scavenged fibers. These were not just gifts, but tangible proofs of their continued existence and love. The faint, earthy smell of freshly worked wood or fiber would occasionally drift through the barracks, a testament to this burgeoning, quiet industry of affection. What no one had fully anticipated was the subtle shift in the dynamic between the prisoners and their captors. While the power imbalance remained, the shared ritual of mail, of facilitating these precious connections, fostered a nascent, unspoken understanding. A guard might offer a small piece of twine for a prisoner to secure a letter, or an interpreter might spend extra time ensuring a message was perfectly conveyed. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant, were building fragile bridges of mutual respect across the chasm of war. Yet, the larger strategic implications of this human experiment remained a subject of intense scrutiny. The initial goal of extracting intelligence had been largely superseded by the unforeseen psychological impact. The prisoners, while more communicative, were not necessarily more compliant in matters of military intelligence. The why of the Allies' continued investment in this project, diverting resources, manpower, and risk, was still being written, a complex narrative of war and unexpected humanity. The next question was, how would this profound shift influence the very landscape of their future, both within and beyond the camp walls? The why became clearer with time. Allied intelligence, hardened by years of brutal combat, realized they had stumbled upon something more profound than a mere tactic. The original premise of an impenetrable psychological barrier, a collective refusal to engage, had been slowly eroded not by force, but by a quiet affirmation of shared humanity. The simple act of facilitating mail, initially a speculative endeavor to manage prisoners, revealed a powerful truth. Hope, even a flicker, made men more receptive, less prone to the deep, silent despair that made them unmanageable. It wasn't just about extracting information. It was about understanding the enemy not as a monolith, but as individuals. The faint aroma of distant home carried on paper, once a ghost, now became a tangible link to a world worth re-engaging with. This understanding, born in the humid air of Pacific camps, left a profound legacy. It subtly influenced future doctrines on prisoner management and cultural intelligence, teaching that empathy, not just coercion, held unexpected power. The lessons learned here, about the enduring power of connection across vast divides, shaped how nations would approach conflict and reconciliation for decades to come. It taught that even in the darkest corners of war, the smallest acts could ignite the most unexpected transformations. Respira. For those who wish to delve deeper into the sources and continue this line of stories, access the complete playlist on WW2 Beyond Battles and save the dossier in the pinned comment. The cold that once bit deep into the bone, a constant companion in the stark confines, never truly disappeared. But for those Japanese POWs, revived by whispers from home, the internal chill of hopelessness had been replaced by a quiet warmth. The crisp rustle of a letter, its worn edges a map of memory, became the symbol of that transformation. It was a simple piece of paper, yet it carried the weight of worlds, proving that even across vast oceans and brutal battlefields, the human heart could find its way home.